But even if that's not the way it's being done and you're an accredited investor, you still should have some education on knowing what you're doing. And you alluded earlier today on our call about a book that I have, right? And that's why I wrote the book, is to give people education.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Gentle Art of Crushing It show, where we focus on learning and sharing with our listeners all there is to know about how to create success in our lives. This show stands on the shoulders of giants. Our mission is to empower and inspire our listeners to create the life of their dreams whilst having a blast in the process. Let's celebrate life together. Welcome to the show.
All right. Welcome to the Gentle Art of Crushing It podcast, Passive Investing Edition. My name is Randy Smith, and I'm your host today. And I'm just really excited to have Matt Picheny on the show. He's really an expert in this space, and I think he's going to bring a ton of value. So, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Looking forward to it. So yeah, why don't we kick this off like we always do? Can you just give us a little bit about your background, talk about your journey a little bit, and ultimately how you found the passive investing space?
Sure. I'd be happy to tell you. I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and I moved to New York City to pursue a career in theater. And I was a professional actor for 5 years. Was in 15 different productions all across the US. And then I started tinkering around with computers as a hobby and actually had my own company doing website development. This was in the late 90s. 2001 rolled around. And I don't know if you remember where you were in 2001, but that was when there was the big dot-com bubble bursting. Yeah. And so everything was just haywire and my business was imploding. All of my clients were going out of business or not spending money on digital marketing efforts. And luckily, at that exact same time, I got a phone call from my landlord who told me I had 90 days to get out of the apartment that I was living in.
Congratulations. Yes.
So, that freaked me out. What am I going to do? How am I going to find a place to live in New York City without a job, without any income from my business? And I ended up getting a job in-house at Showtime, the cable television channel. They were a client of mine. And I ended up, instead of renting another apartment, I actually bought an apartment way uptown, like way uptown. Not necessarily where I wanted to live, but I was able to afford something. But the thing was, a little over 2 years later, I sold that apartment and I saw my initial investment, my down payment, more than quadruple in value.
Unbelievable.
And so that was the big light bulb moment for me. I was making a very good living at that point in time. I had a good salary, but that one transaction was more money than I would make in an entire year of working. And so I wanted to know, how can I go ahead and do that again? So that's when I really started getting involved in wanting to do real estate investing. Mm-hmm. And over the course of many years, I did it as a hobby. For 10 years, I did it as a hobby while I was working, sort of climbing the ladder in corporate America, or in the advertising world here in New York City. And then there was an opportunity for my wife, a really cool job opportunity for her that would have us needing to leave New York and move to Miami, Florida. And so when we made that move, that's when I transitioned from doing real estate as a hobby to making real estate my full-time job. That's when I became a full-time investor. And that's when I started really passively investing, because all the investment I had done before, I had some sort of active role involved in that. Now, 2/3 of my real estate portfolio are deals that I'm a strictly passive investor in. I'm a limited partner in those deals. But I have 1/3 of my portfolio, which is almost 4,000 units at this point, where I am a general partner. I'm very involved actively in that on a almost day-to-day basis, at least week-to-week basis, depending on how the property is performing, but very involved in the asset management and the ongoing work within that portfolio.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. That was a very quick summary. I'm looking at the time. We're at about 3 minutes. And I spent a few hours with you and your story reading your book. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, you brushed over. There were some interesting challenges that came along that path, a lot of learnings. I'm wondering, with the goal of this show really being geared towards the newer passive investor, can you talk a little bit about your experience in the active space early on, and maybe some of the challenges or learnings you took and are bringing into your business activities today?
In the earlier work that I did, I learned everything. I talk about in the book my first real investment property that wasn't, because that first property that I bought up in the Washington Heights area of Manhattan was a primary residence. But after that, I ended up buying a place on the Upper West Side, which is where I wanted to live. Yeah. And I ended up about a year after that purchasing some land in Connecticut, in Northwest Connecticut, about 2 hours from my home. And there's a whole chapter in the book about this thing. I bought this land, and then I eventually built a house. So it was a land. It was like almost an acre filled with trees. So I really learned, like, we tagged the trees. You had to get that approved, and then we removed the trees, and then we dug a hole, and I learned, like, literally from the ground up what it takes to build a house, right? And apartments, multifamily, whatever real estate that you're talking about, it all comes down to those same basic things where you're digging a hole, you're pouring a foundation, and you're putting in electric, you're putting in plumbing, framing it out, doing a roof, there's a lot of different things. So I learned a lot in that process. And then instead of living in that house, which was my idea initially when I first started down that path, it actually was a full-time rental. It was a short-term rental, but it was always available for rent the whole time that I owned it. And I learned a lot about renting and about leases and dealing with tenants and managing a property remotely. The biggest key takeaway from there, spoiler alert if you haven't read the book yet, was that I did not want to be a property manager. It's a really specific skill set. It's great. I love people who do it, and I love to hire people who are good at it to do it. I think I was adequate, but it was not something that I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed more trying to find properties and going ahead and developing them, adding value, but not necessarily dealing with the day-to-day of tenants and that whole kind of thing. So that was a huge learning from there. But I also learned things like accounting, right? Mm-hmm. Before that, I just did all of my taxes with TurboTax. It was easy. I had a W-2. I typed in the information from the W-2. It was fine. Once I bought that piece of land, I don't know what TurboTax is like now because I haven't used it in years. But back then, there was no way to enter in that I had this investment land. So I had to find a CPA person, which I did. And there was not much going on there at that time. But once we started building the house, all of a sudden I learned about a thing called depreciation and how that works. And that was very eye-opening to me. And so that house really was kind of set the stage for where I am now, because it was a rental. Now, obviously, time has gone on. I've learned how to do it better, and I've expanded from 1 units to now, 4,000 units. But a lot of the principles are the same. Once you jump from that, 1 to 4 unit up to 5 units or more, there is some more complexity, especially as it comes to the financing that's involved in the property. Randy, I know you know that stuff, but
no, this is good.
Right? Yeah. Like once you go to 5 units, it's a totally different, financing model with the mortgage. But as you continue to grow beyond 5 and get to 70, 80, 100 units or more on any particular property, you start to see a lot of efficiencies because you have these economies of scale. And I'll give you one really quick example.
Sure.
We always do a thing called a cost segregation study. What the cost segregation study does is an engineer comes to the property and catalogs every item in the property. Basically, things that are considered personal property are able to be depreciated in a more quicker than the rest of the property because they have different depreciation lives according to the IRS. And there's something going on right now called bonus depreciation, which allows you to do all of it in year 1, but that's starting to sunset. But even before bonus depreciation was a thing, you still, it's great to do this because you can have a lot more depreciation in the first 5 years of the property than you can have in the remainder if you do this thing. But the study costs, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. Mm-hmm. So if you just have a single family property or a duplex, to spend $5,000 to $10,000, what's your tax savings going to be? Does it make sense? Maybe, maybe not. When you're buying a $10 million or more property of like 100 or more units, all of a sudden a $5,000 to $10,000 cost is really just a drop in the bucket. And you can pass those tax savings along to all the investors, and it can be a tremendous windfall for investors. So that's why the economies of scale can work really nicely.
Yeah, no, gosh, thank you. That is a ton of really good, valuable information for the listeners to learn. And we've done calls with cost segregation folks and
cool.
Really dug into some of those deals, but you really summarized that nicely. So thank you for that. I'm curious if, looking back, starting with your own home and then buying the second property and then ultimately doing some development, when you're talking with new investors today, do you think there's value in starting in the active space, or does it make sense just to skip forward and go right into passive investing?
Most people that I speak with have been involved in real estate in one way or another in terms of, maybe active, maybe they had I've talked to people who like, oh yeah, I used to own a rental a long time ago. Yeah. But most people that I tend to come into contact with, I think most people are, maybe like 51%, but barely most. But I think most people have had some sort of active experience. But you don't need to. There's plenty of people that I've spoken with who are very busy, doctors, lawyers, whatever. And they're like, hey, I just know real estate's good. A friend of mine invested with you. He said he made a lot of money. I want to invest with you. It's a lot of sort of word of mouth kind of things is where I've gotten people who just have never done real estate before, but they know that it's good. They know they've had a friend who's had success in it in one form or another, a friend or a relative. And so they want to get involved in it. You don't have to have the active experience, but there are, there's two things. Number one, there's certain SEC requirements depending on how the deal is structured. If you're not an accredited investor where you actually need to be sophisticated, that's like a requirement. But even if that's not the way it's being done and you're an accredited investor, you still should have some education on knowing what you're doing. And you alluded earlier today on our call about a book that I have, right? And that's why I wrote the book, is to give people education on understanding these deals, understanding how they're set up, understanding how they work. Because as a passive investor, while you're not actively doing any of the work, you want to be able to look at the deal and see if you think it makes sense. I have a free guide on my website. It's called Quickly Sizing Up a Syndication. There's a more detailed version inside the book. But so in that, I talk about there's three things that you want to look at, right? You want to look at the sponsor, the deal, the person who's running the deal. That's number one. Yep. Number two, you want to look at the market and understand the market. And number three, you want to look at the deal itself, right? And so if you don't know how to look at a market, you don't know the questions to ask a sponsor, you don't know how to look at a deal and the metrics of the deal, it's hard for you to decide if you want to put 50, 100,000, maybe more into a deal. It's a good amount of money. Even if you are an accredited investor, put $100,000 in a deal, you want to make sure that you're not going to lose it. And so I do think some form of education, whether it's my book or some other, listening to your podcast is one great way, Randy, but there are also books out there, you're welcome, that are good, where people can get sort of educated. So you don't have to have done it actively, but you should be educated so that you know what you're investing in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's so, so important to not just make a decision with your financial dollars just haphazardly, because these are hard-earned dollars. Obviously, if you make good decisions with those, you'll send them out. A friend of mine says you send them out and they come back with friends time and time and time again. So I'd love to kind of get into the mindset a little bit of, active investor. with a ton of experience and lots of learnings there. Over to that very first investment that you made passively. I'm curious, like, what were, were there some fears associated with that? What kind of challenges did you run into? Did you just come across a really passionate, excited, good sales guy and you decided to jump in? Or what did that look like for you?
Yeah. Another thing I write about in my book, because that's a big, that's a monumental thing, right? Your first passive investment. And how does that work? The way that it worked for me was that I met somebody. I knew right away, because of my active experience that I had done, that so when I first found out about syndication, I knew right away I wanted to syndicate deals. But I had to learn. So I started going to classes and courses and, of course, podcasts and books. But one of the first live events, conferences that I went to where I started to learn about this stuff, I met somebody who had already done a deal, and I became friendly with this person. And lo and behold, 6 months later or so, he had a deal.
Yeah.
And he was my buddy. So I invested with him. I mean, he was learning and going through the same education that I was going through, although he was much further along in the system, right, in a program that I was in. He was much further along, and he had already done one deal before. So I decided, if I'm going to invest with someone, I guess I'll invest with him. And
sure.
I invested, and I was freaking out about it. And I wrote a very large check before, except for like buying I guess I had done some real estate. It was a very large check. It was a very large check as far as I was concerned. But I wrote a check and was hoping he would, have it come back with friends.
Right.
And unfortunately, it didn't come back. I came back with like a little teeny tiny little friend, tiniest little friend. Luckily, it didn't come back missing and part of the money, right? So I didn't lose money on it, but we didn't really make a lot of money at all. But I learned a lot about. That's when I really learned the value of vetting these deals, and specifically vetting the sponsor. Had it not been for the guy that I invested in, because I believed in him, had it not been for him, we certainly 100% would have lost money. Yeah. The only reason why we didn't lose money was because of him. Yeah. He was able to save that deal, get it across, get a sale across the finish line at the very last minute. And we did okay. We made a couple bucks, but nothing to really write home about.
Yeah. I think that's such a great point too, that you talk about vetting the operator, but finding somebody that's going to be a good steward of your dollars. And you'll hear folks, I heard folks when I first started in this space where maybe a deal doesn't go exactly as planned. And sometimes operators will actually come out of pocket to make things whole for their investors, because they know that if they make it right this time, on future deals, those folks might be willing to bet with them again. And I think it just really comes down to credibility, accountability, and more than anything, probably integrity of that operator, because there's a lot of really smart, hardworking syndicators that are out there, but there's also a handful of folks that come in because they see people making some easy money and they think they can come in and put together some quick deals. But not all the operators out there have been doing this for 20, 30 years like yourself. So really, really good lesson to vet that operator, know, like, and trust that operator. And it's not necessarily an overnight process. It can be 6 months, 12 months, year and a half before that trust is built. And before you step up to the bank teller and say, I want to wire $50,000 to this guy potentially. So yeah, right. Very neat. Very neat. So, okay. So the first deal goes out. It does okay. You don't lose your money, which actually I'm thinking in these days, I wish I would have taken my entire stock holdings in January and gave them to a guy that just gave me back my money at the end of this year. But it went well enough, and you could start to see the power of how passive investing could impact your life.
Well, Randy, I'll tell you, I was bullish about real estate in general, having done it for so much time that it's not like I just did the one passive investment and then waited and then, for 3 years. which is how long we held the property for. I would say about 3 to 6 months after I invested in a second deal. So before I knew that this deal wasn't going as expected, I was already in another deal.
Okay.
And over the course of about 2 years, I invested, I think, in 5 deals, while also looking for my own deal to sponsor, which I did. I sponsored my own deal. It took about 2 years to get my first deal that I sponsored, and I had 5 that I had invested in passively.
Okay. Yeah. And it seems like that's a pretty common trend I'm hearing. It was similar to myself. I invested in one and I overcame that challenge of wiring the funds the first time. The second one's much easier. The third one's even easier. The fourth one, it's like, whatever you send me, GP, I'm going to bet on you without even looking at the deal. I'm curious though.
Not the horse, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm curious, you mentioned you have a fairly large portion of your investments today in passive investments alongside your active investments. Can you talk to me about strategies? How do you choose? Do you have like a diversification strategy or, a purchase strategy? What kind of strategies do you use to get that capital out into good working deals?
Sure. Well, I use the 3 pillars that we talked about earlier. And so we got to make sure that we're vetting the operator, right?
Yep.
And vetting the market and vetting the deal. Beyond that, from a strategic standpoint, I have diversified my multifamily holdings across different operators in different locations. I can't be everywhere, and I can't meet every broker and property manager on the planet, right? Yeah. And I'm not an expert in every geographic area. So if I can meet Randy, and Randy is an expert in Florida, I'm just making things up, right?
Sure,
and I know that Randy knows the Florida markets extremely well, and he's done 5 deals in Orlando already, and now this is his 6th deal in Orlando, and 2 of them have gone full cycle, whatever. Like, that is way better than me trying to like break into the Orlando market. Although I grew up in Orlando. I love Orlando.
Okay. Yeah.
And my mom still lives there. But that might be better for me to go ahead and place my money with Randy rather than trying to break in on my own, because he's already got everything going on there. So that's how I look at it. So I'm diversified from my passive investment portfolio in, many different states, primarily in the Sun Belt, but not exclusively in the Sun Belt, and through many different operators. And some operators have done well by me, but I just don't like them. Like, not to be mean, I like everybody, but there are some operators that I actually made money from, but I just didn't like them. I didn't like the communication wasn't there. I felt like I never knew what was going on. Things like that I just don't like. And so then I know, what, that operator, like, thank you for giving me a profit, but you're not the right fit for me moving forward. There's been other people who maybe the return isn't good, but they were really upfront. They kept me apprised of what was going on the entire way through. Really liked their communication style. And in that case, I have invested with them again, because sometimes you can get, a deal that's not perfect, and I give people a second chance. So that's important to me, to diversifying operators and geography.
Yep. And I love that you bring that up as well. I've had conversations with some GPs where I'll ask questions about, tell me about a time when things didn't go as planned. And they'll say, oh, we've never had anything not go as planned. And immediately, I try to be as nice as possible, but I'm getting off the phone because you haven't been in business long enough if you've not run into any troubles. And, sometimes just the personalities, and as you mentioned, the communication style, I am the same in that I would almost prefer a lower return, but know what's going on with my investment, than to get an amazing return and not hear from the guy from 90 to 180 days or something like that. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's important. And I think as we get into this shift in the economy and into the marketplace, I think those soft skills are going to become more and more important with operators, because investors, there's probably less investor dollars floating around So it'll take skills like that to make sure they're landing in the right spot. So,
you know, Randy, that really just segues into a perfect thing that I just want to say is that, you know, it's important to me and it's important to you. It might not be important to some people, right? To some people, they might like be, I don't really care. I just want that return. I don't care if I don't hear about it for 5 years and then you just send me this huge check. So my point being that you need to understand as a passive investor what you want, what your values are, and what's important to you, and make sure that the sponsor that you choose, you're aligned, right? And I talk about that's one of the things in the checklist that you want to make sure that your values are aligned.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And, you know, it's this interesting process that I've been learning over the last couple of years where, you know, working in the W-2, you don't always get to choose who you work with. Quite often you're told who you're working with and it doesn't matter whether you get along or not. But in this investment space, you do have this ability to really kind of date and spend some time with these folks and get to know each other before you have to make any type of long-term commitment. So I encourage a lot of my investors and my listeners, like, try to get around that person and spend time with that person, whether it's listening to their podcast, whether it's reading their books. You know, you mentioned your book over and over again. I've spent hours with you before I even had you here on the podcast. And I can tell that you're the type of operator that I want to work with in the future, just from your transparency, just from the integrity that I can see in those pages. And, you know, I feel like I've gotten to know you and your wife and your family by watching these different avenues as well. So I always encourage the listeners, like, spend as much time with that person, either, you know, one-on-one or from what other channels they have out there, because over time, people will show who they are, truly who they are, if you watch them for any amount of time. So yeah, thank you for bringing that piece up. I'm excited to hear a little bit about what you guys are doing now. You mentioned you're a GP as well, which is such a fun thing to go from the active to passive and back to active again. So it does really happen. Can you talk about that journey into the active space as well? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I was always interested in doing. Passive investment came about while I was trying to pursue the active syndication. There was an opportunity. I thought it would be a good learning opportunity. And I had some capital available. And then I just started deploying more and more into that. And then as those deals went full cycle, then I just kept the money in that sort of, you know, passive investment space and just kind of kept redeploying that. It's been great. Concurrently, I've wanted to build out an active portfolio, which I've done. And the two are sort of, you know, their own paths. I could. But the great thing about the passive is I don't even really have to do much, right? I, you know, hopefully the deal's doing well. I get reports. I'll read the reports, but it doesn't really take any of my time at all. It's completely passive, which is nice. Yeah. And then I can focus on those active deals, which is something I've always wanted to do. Having done the passive and still doing the passive, I think gives me a window into what my investors must feel like on certain things. So I try to, as a active investor, keep that in mind, right? What they might be thinking, what kind of information they might want to know. And I've been, you know, focusing on multifamily properties, and I've been doing them mainly in Texas. I've had some properties in Kansas City, would continue to look in that market for new things to purchase. Haven't found anything where the numbers make sense. We sold everything that we've owned in Kansas City at this point, done very well, and made our investors quite happy. Continuing to grow, continuing to build things. For me, it's really important to me to make the world a little bit better than I found it. So everything that we get involved in is always going to be a win-win situation. So when it comes to the multifamily, we're improving the properties for the residents. We do a lot of other great things for residents. We're going to be coming up on Thanksgiving pretty soon. We'll be giving out turkeys to our residents. That's something we do every year. We do something about every 6 weeks or so, nice for the residents, and try to make things great for our employees, the staff at the properties. and also make money for investors. It's not a charity, but we work with residents when they have hard times, if they get laid off from their job, or in COVID, we worked with a lot of people to try to keep them in their units. I think that, I'd like to reinvent property ownership as being a positive for communities. I think we can do well by doing good. And so that's really important to me. And so everything I get involved in is like that. And I'm starting to expand beyond just multifamily and do some other things. Also, my wife and I sometimes will get involved in Broadway musicals. That's what she does full time. It's her thing, but I used to be an actor. I love it. I'm passionate about it. So sometimes we'll join forces on some shows, which is a lot of fun. But I'm continuing to look at things that are win-win situations for everybody involved, where we can improve communities. And the 99% of that has some sort of real estate involved with it.
I love it. I love it. What a neat story. What a neat story. Well, let's, if we can, shift gears a little bit. I do have just a handful of questions I like to ask all of our guests. Okay. Can you share a podcast or a book recommendation that can help the newer passive investor continue their journey?
Besides my book? Haha, just kidding. No, I really
in addition to, yes.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad was a great book, but I'm sure everyone says it. So I'll tell you, I really like Ray Dalio's book, Principles for the Changing World Order. Talks a lot about sort of the rise and falls of countries and macro cycles. It's extremely interesting to read, especially where we are right now with our country. I think it's a very valuable book. And so that's the one I would recommend, Principles for the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio.
Okay. I have heard that book so many times, and I have been avoiding it. I'm not quite sure why, but I have. I am going to pick that up and read it. And in addition, as I mentioned, to yours as well. So are there any like special resources? You mentioned a couple of things on your website, I think prior to this, but can you reference any special resources that really might help the new passive investor as well?
I shameless plug again, and it's completely free on my website. I have written tons of articles. I post one every month, and I send it out to my newsletter, but I put them on there, and there's tons of articles on there. So it's completely free. Go check it out. But I also find that I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And so I find that on LinkedIn, if you start to get involved in a community of people who are doing, who are real estate, and start connecting with people involved in real estate, it'll start coming up on your feed. You can learn a lot from, those articles that I write, I post them on LinkedIn too, right? So a lot of people are putting content out there on LinkedIn. There's also a lot of content on YouTube. I have a couple of videos on YouTube. I want to start doing more, but you can go on a YouTube and learn a lot. There's podcasts like this one. That are great. There's tons about, when I started off, I talk about in the book, I called it Podcast University, but none of them were about multifamily. They were all about single family. And then I found one that was about multifamily. And now there's like tons of them that are about multifamily and passive investing. They were all active, but now there's a lot about passive investing, and not just in multifamily, in self-storage, in, mobile home parks and all of that. So, hop on Google, find some podcasts, find some different, communities online. There's a lot of opportunity out there to learn about this stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, there's more information today than there's ever been. The new passive investor has access to so many different resources. Literally, like you said, just a simple Google search. And any operator out there has pages and pages of free content on their websites, and definitely great books. So kind of a fun one. I'm curious, do you have a recent bucket list item you've checked off your list that you would like to share with the audience?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. One thing that's kind of cool that I always wanted to go, and I just never wanted to go right then, but I always wanted to go to Paris.
Okay.
And so I just took my wife to Paris for our 10th wedding anniversary. That was kind of cool.
Congratulations. Yeah.
I have I don't have like a whole bunch of things that I'm like, gee, I really want to do this and haven't been able to, fortunately. I always wanted to win a Tony Award, and this year last season we won 2. So
did you really? Fantastic.
Yeah, Tony Awards. So that was fun. I always wanted to write a book. Got the book out. I don't know. Maybe I have to come up with some more things, Randy. Now that I'm thinking,
that's amazing. I don't run into folks that don't have a bucket list still chasing. So that's fantastic, though, that you've been able to do.
I need to raise the bar a little bit. I don't know. I love traveling. I want to continue to travel. There's many countries I would like to go to. So that's But I like to spend time with my kids. That's the most important thing for me. So.
I love it. Well, very good. Well, anything else that you would care to share with the audience before we get your contact info or how we can find you out there?
I think that success in life is really about developing relationships. It's about having persistence and being educated. So I think like if there's 3 things to take away from this interview to someone, whether you want to be active or passive, it's like build those relationships. Be persistent and make sure you're educated. If you are educated, I'm always learning. I'm always reading new books or podcasts or going to seminars. I'm always learning, and that's important.
So relationships, persistence, and education.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, very, very, just great spending some time with you here. I really appreciate it. And the content and value you brought was fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really do appreciate it.
No, Randy, thank you so much for having me. I love being here.
Outstanding. Well, to our listeners, again, I strongly encourage you, go out there, grab his book, check it out. I can vouch for it. It is fantastic. Definitely follow him on social. We'll put his contact information in the show notes. And the advice I always leave, continue to educate yourself to the point where you become confident enough to make that first passive investment. And once you do, I promise you will never look back, and it'll be a great addition to your strategy. So thanks so much for listening, everyone, and we'll look forward to having you on another show.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, another episode of The Gentle Art of Crushing It. It was an amazing episode. We know we sure learned a lot, and we hope you did as well. We want to take a second and thank you so much for viewing or listening to this episode. And please just know that we only ask for one favor, and that is to make this life magnificent. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.